This episode is part of Glendale Library Arts and Cultures and the Southern California Library Cooperative's Be the Change series, which focuses on inclusion, diversity, equity, anti-racism.
Be the Change events will build collective understanding of systemic racism, elevate the voices and stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and inspire our community to be the change.
Hi everyone, it's Melissa.
And Desiree.
Welcome to another episode of Teen Gen Talks, where the goal is to empower the youth of Glendale and connect youth to community resources, individuals, and organizations through interviews and discussions.
Today's special guest is Johnnie Jae. Johnnie Jae is an Otoe-Missouria and Choctaw rabble-rousing journalist, organizer, creator, and futurist. She is the founder of A Tribe Called Geek, an award-winning media platform for Indigenous geek culture and STEM, and #IndigeNerds for Hope, a suicide prevention initiative designed to educate, encourage, and empower Native youth. Jae is the co-founder of Not Your Mascots and Live Indigenous OK. She is a member of the Women Warriors Work Collective and served as the co-chair for the March for Racial Justice. She leads numerous workshops that address mental health and suicide in Indian country, Native mascots and stereotypes, Indigenous representation and journalism, Indigenous STEM and tech, and the utilization of social and digital media for business and activism. Her ability to seamlessly shift from humor and pop culture to advocacy and business has made her a much sought after speaker, panelist, and commentator.
But before we get started, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at MyGlendaleLAC. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and Apple, wherever you listen to your podcast. Also make sure to give us a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Glendale Library Arts and Culture, where we post full episodes every Friday at 4:30 p.m. Thank you, Johnnie Jae, for taking the time every day to talk with us. We have a lot to discuss.
We sure do.
So to start off, you have done a lot of amazing things, and we want to touch upon all of them a little bit. But to start off, you wear many hats, one of them being a multimedia journalist. What about journalism drew you to it?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, I've always done more management and more on the corporate side of things. And I had gotten really sick. I have lupus. And when you have lupus, you can't really get too comfortable. You kind of have to roll with the punches in terms of what you can or can't do. And I had been really sick for a long time, which had kind of made me think about like, okay, I need to shift gears somehow. And it just happened that I saw an ad for Native Max magazine, which is one of the first Native fashion magazines in existence. And they put out a call for writers. And I was like, well, I've always wanted to be a writer. So, let me just apply and see what happens. And I sent in my samples, I sent in my application, and they called me back and they were like, okay, well, we would like for you to write for us. And I was really surprised about how much I liked it. I'm not a very fashion-y person, so it was kind of a learning curve because I actually got hired as the fashion editor. And my attire at this time was very much like what I'm wearing now: a t-shirt, hoodie, jeans, Star Wars tee specifically at that time. And so I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? But I really loved it because I was able to start connecting with more people within Indian country and learning about the work that was being done, not only in fashion, but just in community in general regarding culture and business. And it was such an eye-opening experience. And it was more about connecting with people. And with Natives, we're so marginalized, and we're less than 2% of, well, I think less than 5% now with the latest census of the US population. So we're a very small community. And our stories aren't often told. We don't have the opportunity to tell our own stories. So what was really exciting about journalism and getting involved with Native Max was that for the first time, we were able to start telling our own stories and reclaiming those narratives and finding ways to communicate those stories with people outside of our communities. Because, I think that's one of the hardest things to do because, we all know each other, we can talk to each other, but what good is it doing us if we're just talking to each other and not bringing others in? and letting them experience what we experience as well. So I think that's one of the things that really drew me to journalism, is just being able to tell those stories, to share those stories, but also being able to connect with people and really learn about, the work that is driving our communities.
And I know this might be like a hard question, but is there a piece that you have written that you really love?
There is. So we deal with an issue called tribal disenrollment. And it blew my mind when I started learning about this, because I couldn't fathom that, as small as our community is, that there were tribes who were working to kick people out and disenroll them as tribal citizens. And it's a really hard issue to address because we're sovereign nations. So, through the UN and through our sovereign status, we do have the right to determine who is and who isn't part of our communities. And so there is this gray area where this is technically legal, but not moral. And there's a lot of hoops to jump through in addressing it, and also trying to remedy the problem, because in order to remedy the problem, we have to change our tribal constitutions in order to make it illegal, or to change how enrollment is viewed. So I really love being able to write that article and write about what Natives who are experiencing when they're being up for disenrollment. And because it's heartbreaking, you grow up Native, you're part of your Native community, and then all of a sudden you have your government telling you that, for whatever reason, whether it's greed or corruption, or just political differences, that they no longer want you to be part of the tribe, and that they are moving to disenroll your family. So it's not just individuals. They're going through and they're disenrolling entire families. And they're not just using living relatives, they're actually going back and disenrolling relatives who have passed on. And that disenrolls their entire bloodline. And so, the repercussions of the issue are so huge, but being able to start telling that story and opening that conversation up, because at the time, nobody was talking about it. My article was one of the first to be published that really addressed it and really addressed how it was happening. And, since then, it's become a movement where, the people that are up for tribal disenrollment are starting to mobilize together to address how this is impacting them, and working to find ways to get the government involved in, maybe withholding funding from tribal nations that are engaging in this practice, because it is an act of genocide. Just the problem is that it's no longer non-natives who are, pushing these policies forward. It's our own community. So I think that's one of the pieces that I really loved writing, just because, it opened a door for bigger conversations to happen.
So you are the founder of A Tribe Called Geek. What was the inspiration behind creating the platform?
Well, I deal with so many issues that are so serious, like what I was just discussing. And, when I was with Native Max, I moved from fashion editor to culture editor to, becoming the managing partner of Native Max magazine. And, and because of my position changes, I started dealing with more serious issues. And it really gets overwhelming at times. And I'm a huge Star Wars geek. I've always been, such a nerd. I'm a Harry Potter fan. And I realized, with Native Max, we were opening doors within the fashion industry. But I also started to realize, like, we're not just about the issues we face, or what's going on. We're not just our culture. We're not just, about fashion. We're also involved in in other industries. And pop culture is a huge industry that we are involved in, but the way that we're represented or misrepresented is all that most people know. They really don't know what authentic contributions have been made by Native people. And I started thinking about, like, okay, well, I'm working with Native Max, and I thought about, well, what can I do to kind of change this? Because I've always been more into tech. I've always been more into STEM. And I started thinking, let's try this. Let's try to bring people together. And it actually started off as its own social media platform. And people could join, they could have their chat room, they had their own profile, we had message boards. And we were up to about maybe 100 users, which at the time was really good. And I was paying everything out of pocket. So it kind of got too expensive and I had to put it on the back burner, and Native Mac started taking off and getting more popular. So, I had to put more attention there. So I put it on the back burner. And it just happened that because of my work with Not Your Mascots, I was asked to do an interview with Jack Malmstrom from Rose City Native Radio out of Portland. And after we got done doing the interview, we started talking about comic books. And then I realized we started going back and forth because I had my own podcast at the time, Indigenous Flame, and we were just going back and forth to talk geek and Indigenous pop culture. And so finally we were just we really need to do something together. And so we started putting together a podcast. And then, because we were looking for a name, I was like, well, I had A Tribe Called Geek. I said, I have the domains, I have the socials, I have everything already set up for that where we could just plug and go. And she's like, that sounds really good. And I was like, yeah, I think we're onto something here. And so we started doing our podcast. And then we were like, we need a theme song. And we have a really cute theme song that originally it was to the theme of Adventure Time. And it was instead of Adventure Time, it was talking about, at the time she was going as Jack the Pima, and people know me as the Brown Ball of Fury. So it was Jack the Pima and the Brown Ball of Fury. It's a tribe called Geek. And so, and she busted out her hand drum and we put together a little theme song, and, everything kind of fell together in our, we started doing the podcast, and we started realizing we were getting overwhelmed. We couldn't interview enough people. And there were so many people doing incredible things that we were like, okay, we need to grow this somehow. So we started the website. And from the website, it started to doing conferences and panels, and it just kind of grew from there. And recently, I actually sold A Tribe Called Geek to Lee Francis from Native Realities. And I'm still on as editing manager, but it was an opportunity for us to grow our network because Jack Malmstrom, she went on her own because her radio show was gaining in popularity. And she also, had some other interest on the side that she wanted to pursue. So that kind of just left me to do all the writing. The podcast had to go on hold, but, just to keep up with the writing and doing the panels. And so now I'm really grateful that we now have a team of writers and we're able to pay them. I'm also getting paid for a change for this. So everything kind of has really worked out really good. And Lee Francis is such a great person to work with, and he's really been kind of spearheading our work as well, just pushing us forward, and he's always been really supportive. So it was a perfect fit because our values kind of in line with each other in pushing indigeneity forward, and getting the word that Native nerds are here. So it's a beautiful partnership, and I'm really excited about to see how we grow from here.
Oh, that's awesome. We actually did interview Lee Francis last year. So it's nice. It's kind of like a full circle. It seems like it was like a journey, right? And throughout that journey, what did you learn from all of it?
I think I really learned that I'm capable of more than I thought I was. And also that you can find passion in your work. It doesn't just have to be a chore that you're doing, that you can do something that you really enjoy. And I also learned that it feels really good to be able to be like, I told you so. Because growing up, it's okay to be an athlete. It's okay to be a scholar. But natives, we're still trying to figure out who we are. Coming back from genocide, we're still rebuilding our communities, still reclaiming our cultures and our languages. And so we're still trying to learn who we're going to be from this point forward, and how do we get there to be those people. And so, it's okay to be an athlete in our communities. It's okay to be a scholar. Those are things that people understand. But we're also part of very different subcultures as well. Growing up, I was goth. It's a very scary goth. My prom picture is just terrible. I'll just tell you that. It's because I was all gothed out. But, we're part of these subcultures, whether it's goth, whether it's, in geek culture, which was kind of my field too. I grew up going to Star Wars conventions, and, I think that was one of the things that I learned, was just that it feels really good for all these things that people told me weren't going to get me anywhere, or that weren't worth my time, that I should focus on things that were more meaningful or more financially stable, that those would be the things that would get me somewhere. So it feels really good to be able to kind of prove them wrong. Like, hey, you remember when you told me comic books wouldn't do me any good? You remember when you told me horror movies would get me nowhere, that I was wasting my time? It feels really good now to show the value in those, but also to be able to encourage our youth who are also into those things to know that, there is a career possible in the things that you love. You just got to find the right avenues and have the courage to go for it, regardless of, all the naysayers around you. I mean, my mom, she's always been one of my biggest supporters, and she always made sure that for me and my siblings, like, we had all the opportunity in the world, because she didn't have a lot of opportunity growing up. So she wanted to make sure that we did. So me and her, like, growing up, our relationship was always really contentious because we were always pushing at each other. And I didn't really understand what it was all coming around towards until, I got older, and I realized, like, whoa, this is what my mom was setting me up for. She was making sure that I had all the necessary knowledge to do whatever it is I wanted in life. And I didn't realize that at the time. She was putting me on music lessons. I was really shy. She had me in acting. She had me in dance, which didn't last long because I'm so clumsy. But all these opportunities that she was giving me, I played the cello. And there were just so many things that I really didn't understand, why I had to do them. And now I understand, like, oh, because now I have a really good foundation where I could pretty much build a career on anything that I want. I'm very flexible, but she made sure we had that knowledge. But, at the same time, I used to be in debate, and I remember us arguing, bumping heads. And I remember one time she was telling me, I don't know what you're doing, wasting your time with comic books. They're never going to you're not going to have a career in comic books. And I remember we were fighting about this, and she finally just got so tired of it. She was just like, if you want to argue, she goes, why don't you go stand in front of the mirror and argue with yourself? And we were going back and forth. And the next day she went to my debate teacher and told him if he couldn't control me at home, that she was going to pull me from the team. Because I was getting too good at the back and forth with her. But, it felt really good to know that, my mom actually really did support me, and that, while she didn't really understand what I was doing, she still supported me. She got to come to Indigenous Comic-Con right before the pandemic hit, our last one, and she was able to really see what I did. Because she would hear people, she would see interviews that I did. She would, I would tell her about what I'm doing, but she really didn't understand. And she finally got to come to Indigenous Comic-Con. And, afterwards, it was so validating, because she was just like, I get it. I understand now. And she told me, like, I was wrong. She goes, this really did help you build something that you love doing and that you're good at doing. And it meant a lot, because she also played into Indigenous Comic-Con. She actually trolled me on my own turf. My sister told me that she wasn't feeling well and stayed at the hotel. And so I was thinking, oh man, like, she's not going to get to come see my panels. And, I was kind of disappointed. And I go in to do my first panel of the day, and there's a Chewbacca in the back of the room, and so annoying. Like, they were just and just behaving weird, and it was throwing me off. And when I walked by from handing out pamphlets, pinched my butt, and I froze. And I was like, do I get security? Like, do I get them thrown out now? And then I was like, no, I got to do my panel. I was like, I'll tell them afterwards, and that'll be that. And all through my panel, like, the Chewbacca was back there being super distracting. And I kept thinking, if you don't want to be here, why are you here? Like, why are you doing this to me? And because I was trying to hold it together, keep on task. And afterwards, I have a zombie whacker that I let people take pictures with. Because the panel I was doing at the time was surviving the zombie apocalypse rest stop. And so I had this weapon that people could take pictures of, and the Chewbacca came up and grabbed it and wanted a picture. And I was talking with two ladies who were actually trying to hire me for their conference. And she came right between us. And I was thinking rude, but also trying to show them that, I could roll with the punches. I was like, okay, I'll take your picture. And they didn't just want one picture, they wanted two. And then they kept posing. And I was thinking, God, this Chewbacca is so, like, just the nerve of this Chewbacca. I was just like getting so annoyed. And then finally the conference, like my panel was over and me and my sister and her family left the room. And I saw one of my friends that I went over to introduce them to. And I was telling her, like, I really wish my mom had been here to meet you because her name is also Johnny. And so, I really wanted them to meet. And she's like, oh, well, it's great. It's, we'll meet next time. And this Chewbacca just runs up and hugs me, like grabs me in a bear hug. And I'm sitting there frozen, like thinking, do I yell for security? And why is nobody helping me? Turns out it was my mom. They had gone to a Halloween store and she got a Chewbacca costume because she saw other people dressed up in cosplay. Now, the funniest thing was that she didn't know who Chewbacca was. So after all this went down, she's walking around in her Chewbacca costume. And, we have the 501st there. We have other Star Wars fans who are up in cosplay and they all want a picture because there's no other Chewbacca. And so they're all asking her for pictures. People are walking by speaking Wookiee to her and she doesn't understand any of it. Like, she's just like, why did they growl at me? And I was like, Mom, that's how he talks. So, and asking her to speak Wookiee. And it was so funny because she just had no clue who she was. She thought she was a teddy bear.
Oh my gosh.
That's what made it so funny. But she got me so good on my turf. But also I realized, my mom is an amazing person because, she came through. Not only did she want to come see what I was doing, but she took the initiative to get involved, even though it wasn't comfortable to her. And she didn't know what she was doing, obviously. But, it taught me, that parenting is hard when your kids are kids. Like I hate to say it, but I think when we're young, we're all a little strange, all a little weird, because we're all trying to figure out, who it is we want to be. And, it's okay to be weird. And I realize, now that to have a little more patience with parents, because they don't have a playbook of how things are going to go. We don't have a playbook of how we're supposed to grow up and who we're supposed to be either. So, all together, we're all just trying to do the best we can. But, I think it really taught me that, as much as you kind of grow up thinking, well, my family don't really support me, or they just don't understand me, that they're trying. And, and regardless of whether or not they do understand you or not, they do love you and they do support you, even if they don't necessarily understand it. So I think that was one of the best lessons I learned because it really changed the relationship with my mom.
So you are the co-founder of Not Your Mascots and Live Indigenous OK. Could you let everyone at home know what the organizations are?
Yes, well, Not Your Mascots, obviously, is kind of like what the title says. We try to raise awareness about why Native mascots and, all the caricatures that you see within pop culture are not reflective of who we are as Indigenous people, but also how those images change the way that other people, non-natives, view and treat Indigenous people as well, because they really dehumanize who we are. And it's easy to be able to ignore the issues that other people are facing when you don't necessarily have a human connection to them, or when you don't even think they exist, which I know it sounds weird, but there are a lot of people that think that natives are extinct still. I don't know how many times that I've heard these weird questions, and I try to be really patient because I'm thinking it's 2021, guys. Come on, you got the internet, you could Google, but people are really like, oh, I thought natives were wiped out. And, or asking, do you still live in teepees? And, like even when you're watching mainstream news, CNN had where they were talking about I believe it was the pandemic, it may have been the election, but where natives were labeled something else. And, we kind of played around with that and we kind of joked around like, oh, we're something else now, but it's really kind of demoralizing when, it is 2021 and we do have more ways to connect with each other and learn from each other, that the efforts aren't being made to include Indigenous people. So the work that we do is trying to bridge that divide and, with education and just making people understand that there is real life harm that comes from these caricatures and these mascots, that aren't real. They're cartoons. And people, have this ability to say, okay, well, that's just a cartoon. And we hear it all the time when we're talking about this, like, it's just a cartoon, it's just a mascot. But at the same time, it is, but it isn't, because those mascots and those caricatures impact the way that policy is created that involves Indigenous people. It impacts the way that we get our education or that we're going for a job interview, because it implants these ideas of who we are that aren't really reflective of who we are. And, it's not a positive stereotype. Even though it's a team you love, the impact that it has isn't positive, because people aren't associating anything positive with us as Indigenous people. Like when we go in for medical care, even, the things that we have to overcome to get the help that we need is the idea that Native people are all alcoholics, that we're drug addicts, that, that we're not educated, or that that our culture is the health issue that needs to be overcome. And so with Not Your Mascots and even Live Indigenous Okay, which has always been more focused on policy within Oklahoma regarding Indigenous people and education, both organizations have really worked to really address the way that Indigenous people are treated within mainstream society, but also trying to bridge that gap in education, because education is where things change. The more we learn about each other, the more that we realize like our histories are very intertwined, then the more we're able to really connect with each other and start treating each other as human beings.
And you have also led numerous workshops. How has leading those workshops shaped you, and how do you prepare for them?
Oh, preparation is hard. And I realize this, especially now that, we've gone through this pandemic and everything has shifted online. There are so many things that you don't think about. I didn't realize how hands-on a lot of my workshops are until I'm asked to do them virtually. And whereas, when I'm doing them in person, like there's a lot of back and forth. And then it takes up the whole time and you're thinking, I wish I had more time. And it's more interactive. And then when you're doing it on Zoom, you start realizing like, oh, this is going to be like 5 minutes long because there's no back and forth. There's, I don't have enough slides to fill this. So it's been kind of a learning curve trying to adjust. But I think one of the ways that I've always been able to prepare is just trying to find ways like to connect with people without having to really explain things in depth, without having to go back and do a primer before I talk about what I'm going to talk about. So how I've set up my workshops is I try to connect them to things I know people are already familiar with, that they have a framework for, because then it's easier to kind of plug and play. Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse Rest Style is one of my more popular presentations. And it's not just about survival, and because I talk about communication, I talk about survival, strongholds, and how natives survived genocide, and in a way that's not preachy. But I talk about all the ways that our communities have been able to survive different atrocities, our own apocalypses, and how that's prepared us to really survive anything else. We already know, like, okay, right away, when the pandemic hit, we knew we were going to be impacted because we don't have the resources that we need. We knew that we didn't have easy access to medical care. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, our communities were already starting to mobilize and figure out, okay, what we're going to need to do to keep our people safe. A lot of communities cut their communities off completely and don't allow non-natives in at all. And they have checkpoints so that there's no one allowed to come in and out. We also had to learn how to communicate with each other and help each other out. A lot of mutual aid efforts went up right away in more urban areas like me for LA. There were several groups that were putting together care packages to make sure that people had what they needed to stay home, and people were putting together traditional medicines to give to community members who were dealing with COVID, and also to help prevent, boost their immunity. They were using our medicines, giving them out, and they weren't charging for this. Like these were all done for free. People were taking donations online or starting GoFundMe so that they could get this out to the community. And it felt really good because, that's what my workshop was on. And I've been given this workshop for almost 7 years now. And it was kind of good to see that, the information that I was giving was kind of right on the head.
Mhm.
And I was like, yes, I get to see this in action. And I was right. Like I did my research. But it's a lot of research. And because especially that workshop, Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse, it does two things. It talks about Indigenous survival, and it lets me give people a history of how we've survived and how our communities operate. But at the same time, it helps me to address mental health in a way that is culturally sensitive, because there are a lot of tribes and communities where they think that if you speak something into existence, you give it power. And so they ask you not to use words like suicide or depression or alcoholism, just that you don't give it power. And so it was kind of an easy workaround. I just replaced all those things with zombies. And I'm talking about how to survive zombies. And it's a framework that, we've all watched The Walking Dead. We all grew up on zombie movies. We understand the framework of survival in that context. So it was easy to plug and play. It was easy for me to talk about mental health because, we're talking about communication. We're talking about strongholds, the places and people that we knew to turn to feel safe and supported. I talk about weaponry, what we need to do to protect ourselves, whether it's physically, but also mentally. Like we need to know like what our triggers are. We need to know, what we're going to need in those instances to protect ourselves. And I also talk about communication, which, is very key in dealing with your mental health, because you need to be able to communicate your needs. You need to be able to communicate what you're feeling and, who and how to communicate it. Because I think that's the hardest thing is realizing like, okay, I need help, but how do I ask for that help? And that's been really important to me because I am a suicide survivor myself, and I've lost a lot of loved ones to suicide. So, and mainly I think about when I was young, my first suicide attempt was when I was 15. And I didn't really have a support system, and nobody in my family or even community really knew how to approach what was going on with me because there is such a stigma with suicide and mental health. So a lot of times growing up, when I was having issues, it was like, you need to straighten up, you need to behave. People are going to think you're crazy. You're not going to go to college. You're not going to be able to do this or that just because of the stigma attached. So, I'm very fortunate that I was able to find my way forward and get the help that I needed as I was older. But now, I want to make sure that our youth have that information, while they're young, and that they don't have to go through the struggles that a lot of us older people did when we were younger.
We also have some questions from a local Glendale team named Kalia. The first question is, why are you called the brown ball of fury?
I like to argue. And when I was younger, and I grew up with brothers, and my sister's really tomboyish too, and I was the nerd. So I kind of got bullied by my sibling. But and we grew up in Oklahoma. So in Oklahoma, when you're growing up and you grow up native and rural, we're kind of rough. We like to, when we fight, it's not like a siblings fight, we fight. And we argue, it's constant. And it used to be funny because our parents would punish us by making us hug it out. So if we got in trouble or we were fighting with each other, they would have us on a couch and we'd have to hug until we meant it. And so, and it was always so funny because we'd be hugging, parents leave, we start hitting each other, then they come back, we're hugging, like, we mean it, I love him, but I was short. I'm the shortest one in my family. Everybody's over 6 feet tall and I'm 5'3". And my mom, I don't know if you guys have seen Brother Bear, but the little bear was trying to get feisty with the big bear. And, he was like, well, you're a little brown ball of fury. My mom started calling me that because I was a little scrapper, but I just tiny arguing. And, she always just said, you're just like a little brown ball of fury. And I'm rotund. So, that kind of helps. And it was funny because it was always just a family name. But when I was working with Native Max, powwows.com wanted to do an interview with me. They wanted to know more about me. And I was like, oh, this is different. And it was the first interview that I had ever gotten to do about the work that I was doing. And I had mentioned off screen, off record, I thought that, that because she asked, do you have any nicknames? And I was like, yeah, I was like, my mom calls me Mittens and Brown Ball of Fury. And when the article came out, it said, our interview with the Brown Ball of Fury herself, Johnnie Jae. And I was like, oh no. I was like, oh no. Because powwows.com is one of the biggest publications in Indian country. And sure enough, as soon as that article came out, that's what everybody started calling me. And then they shortened it to BBOF. So now I'm the Brown Ball of Fury publicly.
I love that.
So what did it feel like to be featured in a variety of media outlets such as BBC, CBC, Indian Country Today, and more?
Scary. I grew up very rural, and I grew up in a very small town, and seeing the work that I do being talked about like on a global scale, being asked to be interviewed on topics that are on an international level regarding Indigenous rights, having my work with A Tribe Called Geek being taught in colleges or in classrooms, it's scary because, I do things because I love doing them and there's a need for them to be done. But I don't really ever think I thought about the impact that it would have, or that people would actually be interested in me as a person, the person behind the work that I was doing. And that's a very scary thing because, not everybody is going to agree with you. And we know that we live in a society where it doesn't matter what you're talking about. There's always going to be somebody who takes issue, and we deal with a lot of trolling online, and it's terrifying to be in that position. I hold my breath with every article that comes out because I just don't know what the impact is going to be. I don't know if I'm going to get, a lot of support and people are going to be like, okay, this is good, or if I'm going to be trolled, or both, because both are a double-edged sword because, we're so accessible to each other via social media. Like we actually don't get a break. We're connected 24/7, and it gets a little overwhelming on that front, but it is kind of scary. It's also kind of cool because I did grow up rural, small town, and, it makes me feel good to know that my work has value to people and that it means something to somebody other than me. But at the same time, for the most part, it is terrifying.
So before we end, we have some rapid fire questions. The first question is, what is your favorite color?
Blue.
What is something you have been proud to say you have accomplished?
Being able to make a career out of zombies.
If you could have 3 people dead or alive for dinner, who would you have?
Oh, 3 pet people. Okay, so one would be Michael Myers. And I know he doesn't talk, but it'd be kind of cool to have him, just there, because I do have questions. I think the other one would be Edgar Allan Poe, because I have so many questions about his writing. Just like, one, it's so creepy that you just got to know, like, how were you inspired by this? Like, where did this come from? Like, what happened to you? And I think the other person would probably be my grandpa. He was always so fascinating, positive, fun. He was a residential boarding school survivor, and we didn't really know what he had gone through till after he passed away. And we also didn't know that he was a fluent speaker of Choctaw until after he passed. There was just a lot of things that we didn't really know because he had grown up in a time where it wasn't okay to speak Choctaw. It wasn't okay to be Native. And so I think I'd like to go back and ask him, like, how he was able to really overcome everything he did, but still, like, how did you not lose hope? Because he did become a preacher. And, that's confusing to a lot of people. But I think in a lot of ways, like it was about holding on to what's good and not bad. And so like, I'd really like to ask him, like, how were you able to do this? How are you able to go through what you did, but still come through in such a healthy way to where you were able to have a family, to where you were able to communicate like what you needed. And also just to learn more about the culture, the information that he had that we don't have.
So what is a book that you have recently read or are currently reading that you would recommend?
Oh, these are two easy ones. So I would recommend My Heart is a Chainsaw Massacre by Stephen Graham Jones. I love horror, and it is the perfect horror novel. What I love about it though is that, Stephen Graham Jones, he's a native horror writer. We don't really have a lot of native horror, mainly because I think we have a lot of common sense. So we wouldn't be in those situations. But I really love this book because she has to use her knowledge of horror movies in order to survive her own horror movie that's going on in her life. So I really love My Heart is a Chainsaw Massacre. It's brilliant. But also 50 Notable Native People by Adrian Keane. It just came out, and it features illustrations and the biographies of 50 notable natives throughout history, both in the past and contemporary, which to me is just the coolest thing because I can open this book and I can see my friends, and to see their work being considered notable, to see them getting that recognition, I think is beautiful. But also that I highly recommend it just because I think more people need to know more about the work that Native people are doing. And this is a great way to do it because you got 50 people right away, and in a fun way to read about that work.
So thank you so much, Johnnie Jae, for taking the time out of your day to sit down and talk with us. We learned a lot about you. Can you let everyone at home know about any upcoming projects and where they can connect with you?
Sure. Well, the next thing I have coming up is I'm going to be the MC for the Natives in Tech Conference. And you can find more information on my Twitter and Facebook, which is just Johnnie Jae, JohnnieJae. And you can also find me on Instagram at Johnnie Jae.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure getting to know
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
you.